I had been driving through that rural stretch of Arizona for about 3 hours when my headlights hit a man, lying in the middle of the road. I'm 48 years old and have been hauling cargo for over 2 decades in the Southwest, so my first impulse was to brake hard and assess the situation. He was lying on his back, arms outstretched, his shirt soaked in red as if he'd been run over minutes before. The truck responded heavily. I felt the load pushing from behind as I downshifted, but there was no car accident, no flashing lights on the shoulder, no recent marks in the dry dirt. The red seemed too vivid against the old dust of the road, and I didn't hear any cries for help, no sound other than the engine idling. I let the truck roll slowly without turning it off, because even before understanding why, I already felt that something wasn't right. I had left Flagstaff in the early evening, hauling palletized dry cargo to a smaller warehouse near Yuma. Nothing sensitive, nothing requiring escort or refrigeration, just a tight deadline and a long road ahead. I chose to cut through a rural route to avoid roadworks on the interstate, a common occurrence when you already know the shortcuts in the region. The weather was dry, the sky clear, a weak moon illuminating the desert just enough to outline the low hills. It was the kind of stretch where you can go 20-30 minutes without seeing a single pair of headlights coming from the opposite direction. And precisely because it's so empty, anything out of the ordinary catches your attention. The truck was in excellent condition that night. Tires properly inflated, brakes responding smoothly, dashboard light clear. I had done a full inspection before leaving, as I always do when driving on isolated stretches. The dirt road was firm, without deep potholes, just that thin layer of dust that rises behind the trailer and disappears quickly in the dark. The CB radio was practically silent, just a distant hiss now and then, nothing to indicate nearby convoy movement. My tank was more than half full, so there was no reason to stop until reaching the next illuminated point. It was supposed to be a simple, predictable, almost automatic stretch. I don't usually speed on rural roads, especially with a full load, so I was driving steadily, maintaining a safe margin. Traffic in that area is rare after 10 o'clock at night, basically local farmers or other truckers trying to save time. What you see most are animals crossing, coyotes, sometimes loose cattle, and you've learned to identify the different reflection of their eyes in the headlights. When I saw that human shape on the ground, it didn't look like a run-over animal, it didn't look like a garbage bag, it looked like a person. But the rest of the story surrounding the scene was missing. As I slowed down, I began to pay closer attention to the body's position and its surroundings. There was no fresh dust raised around it, as if no vehicle had stopped there minutes before. The road had a slight incline, and yet the red liquid wasn't running down as I would expect to see in a real accident. The shirt was heavily stained in the center, but the ground around it wasn't to the same extent. These were small details, things you notice when you've seen a real accident over the years, and it was too clean to be recent. I was still a few meters away from him when I thought about taking out my cell phone and calling 911, but I hesitated for a second. The area there has unstable signal. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and I didn't want to stop completely without understanding the situation. My high beams only illuminated him and a piece of the road, while the sides remained plunged into absolute darkness. That's when I noticed something else that bothered me. There was no different smell in the air, neither of fuel nor of burning rubber, and that began to weigh more than the body in the middle of the road. I kept the truck in low first gear, letting it move slowly while I assessed whether to slam on the brakes or turn onto the dirt shoulder. That's when I saw something small next to his right arm, almost hidden in the dust. It looked like a cell phone, screen facing upwards, reflecting the light from my headlights in a strange way. I thought maybe he had tried to call for help and dropped it. At the same time, the object's position seemed too neat, as if it had been placed there to be seen. Logic dictated that I stop and check, because if it were real, I couldn't simply continue driving. But my instinct was pulling me in another direction, and that's unusual for me. I've stopped to help drivers with flat tires. I've signaled accidents until the police arrived, so it's not fear of stopping. The problem was that nothing there was completely closed off. My body wouldn't move, my cell phone wouldn't vibrate, and the silence was too heavy, even for a rural road. I moved a few more meters and aligned the truck so that the left headlight would better illuminate the surroundings. The light opened up the side of the road a little more, revealing a low wire fence and sparse vegetation behind. There was no car hidden directly behind the body, at least not within the direct range of the light. But darkness began just beyond the illuminated circle, and I couldn't see beyond the first row of bushes. It was at that moment that something changed in his posture. It wasn't a clear movement. It wasn't lifting or turning my body. It was just a different tension in the position of my shoulder. Too small for someone passing by quickly to notice, but visible to someone almost stopped and observing. The arm that seemed relaxed and loose was now slightly bent, as if supporting part of the weight. And the red on my shirt hadn't spread even an inch since I'd arrived. My foot left the brake before I could even make a conscious decision. I thought about reversing and driving away in reverse until I had enough space to maneuver better. But on that kind of narrow road, that would also leave me exposed. The trailer behind me created too large a blind spot if someone decided to come from the side. The cell phone on the ground remained there still, screen now off as if it had never been used. And in that second I understood that stopping completely meant getting out of the cab, and getting out of the cab there would be exactly what someone expected me to do. As I began to slowly accelerate to turn left, the body ceased to be a body. It turned sideways in a movement too quick for someone injured and leaned on its knee as if waiting for the right moment. At the same time, 2 points of light came on further ahead, hidden behind the slight curve of the road. Low beams that hadn't been there seconds before. I felt the weight of the truck respond to the accelerator and heard a dry noise coming from the right side as if someone had hit the trailer's bodywork. That ceased to be a doubt at that instant. I didn't stop to look in the rearview mirror for long, but it was enough to see a shadow running along the edge of the road. The man who had been on the ground was already standing, and the red on his shirt wasn't running, wasn't dripping, wasn't doing anything but staining the fabric. The headlights ahead began to move, narrowing the angle of the road a little more, as if trying to block my path without getting too close. There was no cry for help, no desperate gesture, just movement too coordinated to be a coincidence. I steered the truck into the center of the lane and accelerated firmly, feeling the engine respond heavily with the full load. The vehicle in front moved forward slightly, but not enough to completely block the road, perhaps expecting me to hesitate or brake. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man run to the side and disappear into the darkness, while another figure emerged from behind the low fence. It wasn't a long chase, just seconds too tense to measure, but enough for me to understand that they had miscalculated my reaction. Even before I reached the straightest part of the road, I heard a sharp crack coming from behind, followed by a different vibration in the steering wheel. It didn't sound like a tire bursting, it didn't have that loud explosion sound, but the steering became slightly unstable for a few seconds. In the rearview mirror, I saw something small rolling across the road, as if it had been thrown there at the last moment. I didn't stop to identify what it was. I just kept the truck steady, because slowing down there would mean surrendering control of the situation. The headlights ahead appeared smaller in the mirror, as if they had given up trying to completely block the road. Even so, I could still see lateral movement at the edge of the road, shadows following the truck for a few meters before disappearing. The assembly shook again, this time more briefly, and the dashboard didn't indicate any immediate fault. What began as a scene of supposed distress was now directly affecting the safety of my own vehicle. I was already committed to the decision not to stop, but the consequences began right there, before any clear conclusion. The truck wasn't running exactly as it had minutes before, and I knew that any hidden damage could become a problem later on. There was no going back, no slowing down to check, and there was no pretending it had just been a scare. As I accelerated towards the paved stretch a few kilometers ahead, I realized that the trap had been designed to get me out of the cab, not to prevent me from passing. When I finally reached the paved and illuminated stretch closest to the main highway, I pulled over to a 24-hour gas station to check the truck. I got out, my legs still heavy, flashlight in hand, and found 2 of the trailer's tires with clean cuts on the sidewall. Nothing explosive, but enough to compromise the trip if I had driven a few more kilometers. They weren't tears from natural wear and tear. They were precise incisions, probably made by some object thrown onto the road. That's when I understood the sharp crack I had heard while passing the makeshift roadblock. I had to call for roadside assistance, wait for a tow truck, and report the incident to the company. explaining that there had been no collision or spontaneous mechanical failure. The shipment was delayed, the next day's schedule was hastily redone, and I had to file a police report at the nearest station, even knowing that it would be difficult to locate anyone in that area. The police listened, took notes, but made it clear that such cases happened too quickly to warrant an arrest. Operationally, the loss was manageable, but it could have been much worse if I had stopped completely. I returned to the road the following morning, but it wasn't the same. Each empty rural stretch took on a different weight. Every strange object on the road seemed too suspicious. It wasn't just about slashed tires or delayed deliveries. It was about the feeling of having been studied for a few seconds while I considered whether to stop. I kept driving, of course, because it's my job, but that kind of scenery ceased to be just an isolated landscape. Some colleagues later asked if I was sure it was a setup, because nobody saw the car, nobody got the license plate, nobody was arrested. I answered in the simplest way possible, describing what I saw and what I heard, without adding anything beyond what was necessary. The red on the shirt didn't run, the body got up too quickly, and tires don't cut themselves in a straight line from both sides. I don't need more than that to understand what they tried to do on that road. I continued driving on rural roads after that day, including in Arizona again, but not in the same way. Today, when I see anything blocking the road at night, my reaction is no longer to brake first, but to assess the distance, angle, and escape route. This changes how you perceive someone seemingly asking for help in the dark. It's not pride, it's not coldness. It's an adjustment after being placed in a situation designed to get me out of the cab. The truck was repaired, the cargo delivered, the report filed as just another incident with no suspects identified. For the company, it was a delay and maintenance cost, nothing more. For me, the vivid memory remains of how heavy the silence of that road felt, even before any movement occurred. Since then, I never look at a body on the road simply as an automatic victim. If that first story gave you the chills, please hit the like button. It's the best way to let YouTube know these stories are worth sharing with more fellow travelers. Also, drop a comment below. Have you ever seen something you couldn't explain on a lonely stretch of highway? When the dock crew opened the trailer doors, I was still finishing getting out of the cab. The seal was on the parking space. I had checked it myself before parking, so there was no reason to worry. But as soon as the door went up, it was clear that the front pallets were too misaligned to be just road impact. I didn't say anything at the time, I just watched, trying to remember if I had taken any sharp turns during the night. The supervisor stepped inside, stood there looking, and then called me by name in a tone different from usual. That's when the feeling began that I had brought something more than just cargo, even without being able to explain what. I had left a smaller distribution center near Bowling Green in the early evening, carrying regular dry cargo, nothing of high declared value. It was stationery and office supplies, all palletized and wrapped in plastic film, still sealed according to company standards. The metal seal was placed in front of me by the shift worker, and I wrote down the number on the stub myself before leaving the yard. There were no stops off route, no unexpected detours, just a quick refueling stop in a well-lit area of the interstate. It was too smooth a trip to end like that. The route to the other point in Kentucky had no critical sections, just a state highway, and then a small industrial access road. I maintained a steady speed all night, without hard braking or detours due to roadworks or accidents. I didn't encounter rain, strong crosswinds, and the suspension showed no signs of unusual overload. When the load really moves, you feel it in the cabin. The weight changes, the axle reacts differently. On this trip, I didn't feel anything out of the ordinary. The radio was practically silent the entire way, with only one or two truckers commenting on police checkpoints further ahead. There were no warnings about cargo theft in that area, at least nothing that came through the open channel. I made the mandatory stop inside a large, well-lit gas station with visible cameras at the entrance and exit. I was only out of the cab for a short time, just enough to use the bathroom and get coffee. I didn't notice anyone approaching the trailer during that time. When I got back on the road after the stop, I checked the seal with my flashlight as I always do. It was secure, without any recent scratches, no sign of tampering or replacement. The number matched what was noted on my travel log. I even ran my hand over it to feel if there were any seams or unusual marks on the metal. I found nothing, and that's exactly what worried me most afterward. I arrived at the destination yard early in the morning, the sky still somewhat gray and activity starting to pick up in the yard. I checked in, waited for dock clearance, and lined up the truck without difficulty. Everything seemed like a normal unloading routine, with no strange comments from the gate or receiving team. If there had been any prior warning about the cargo, I would have been notified right there. But nobody said anything until the door went up. When the supervisor called me over to take a closer look, I climbed onto the back of the trailer with him and stood there for a few seconds just observing. The first 2 pallets were misaligned, but it wasn't enough to justify the uneven space at the back of the aisle. The row that should have gone straight to the front door seemed interrupted sooner than expected. I tried to mentally reconstruct how I had seen the load during loading, but the image wasn't entirely clear. Even so, it didn't look like a simple roadside arrangement. I went a little further into the trailer and noticed that the plastic film on one of the pallets was torn on the right side. It wasn't a tear from an impact against another item. It was a cleaner, almost vertical cut, and the plastic was folded inwards. When cargo shifts, the damage is usually uneven and spread out, not concentrated like that. I ran my hand over it to feel if it was recent and if the plastic still had a different tension than the rest. The supervisor remained quiet, just watching my movements without saying anything. As the employees began counting the boxes, I noticed something else that didn't add up. Some packages further back had adhesive tape that was different from the original factory tape, a slightly lighter shade and a straighter cut. It wasn't something anyone would notice immediately, but those who work in inventory control learn to spot these small variations. I felt a pang in my stomach because the outer seal was intact. If someone had tampered with it, it hadn't been through the main door. There I had to decide how to position myself before the situation escalated. I could have immediately started defending myself, stating that everything went perfectly with the boarding, but that would only create tension prematurely. I preferred to maintain a calm demeanor and let the official count indicate what was missing. I knew that any exaggerated reaction could sound like premature guilt. At the same time, remaining completely passive also seemed strange. While we waited for the partial report, my mind began to replay every minute of the trip. The stop at the illuminated gas station, the time outside the cab, the moment I checked the seal before continuing. I hadn't heard any unusual noises. I hadn't felt any change in the weight of the load. I hadn't noticed anyone circling around the trailer. And yet, looking at that ransacked interior with the intact seal in my hand, I knew something had happened outside my field of vision. The official count took longer than usual, and that already started to change the atmosphere at the dock. 2 employees came in with clipboards, left, returned with a printed list, and began comparing code by code. The supervisor spoke quietly on the phone, turning his body slightly so I couldn't hear everything. I remained there near the back of the trailer, trying to maintain a neutral expression while observing the activity. The more time passed, the less it seemed like a simple mishap. At one point, one of the guys called the supervisor and pointed to the back of the trailer near the front wall. I couldn't hear the whole sentence, but I caught the word missing being said more than once. The supervisor came back to me with a folded piece of paper in his hand and asked if I had made any unrecorded stops during the night. The question was polite, but too direct to be casual. I replied that no, I had followed my normal route and only stopped in well-lit places with a visible camera. He nodded, but didn't seem convinced. What started to bother me was realizing that no one was commenting on the broken seal. It was as if everyone was trying to understand what was missing before questioning how it happened. The seal was still attached to the door, with no sign of cutting or replacement, and that made the situation stranger than a simple break-in. If someone had forced entry, the damage would be there for everyone to see. But inside, there were boxes that had been opened and closed again, as if someone had taken the time and patience to choose what to tamper with. As the inventory progressed, I noticed that some boxes were slightly lighter when one of the employees repositioned them. He commented on it quietly, almost as a technical observation, but loud enough for me to hear. This indicated that it wasn't just displacement, it was selective removal of contents. And yet, no visible markings on the outside of the trailer explained the access. The feeling of being in the middle of something that didn't make sense began to grow. I began to mentally replay the moment I stopped at the gas station, remembering that I had only been away from the cabin for a few minutes. The parking lot was spacious but not completely full, and there were cameras on the light poles. Even so, I didn't remember seeing anyone circling near my trailer. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that if someone had entered, they had done so in a way that was too planned to be opportunistic. The confirmation came almost without ceremony. Some specific units were missing. Not entire boxes, but items removed from inside and the packaging resealed. This meant that someone not only entered the trailer, but knew exactly what to look for. The supervisor took a deep breath before showing me the discrepancy in the report, and at that moment I realized the problem had gone beyond a simple cargo discrepancy. The consequences began there, before any direct accusation. No one raised their voice, no one pointed a finger, but the atmosphere changed. I began to be observed more closely than before, as if every word I said could weigh on the outcome of the internal investigation. The intact seal became a central piece of the conversation because it eliminated the most obvious explanation. If there was no external breach, then the access must have happened at some invisible point in the process, and I was the most obvious link between origin and destination. I could have pressed for an immediate review of the cameras, demanded a technical analysis of the seal, or even requested police presence at that moment, but I chose to avoid direct confrontation in the yard. I knew that any more aggressive reaction could worsen the perception of me. I stood there answering their questions and awaiting further instructions, while the feeling that something had been done behind my back became difficult to ignore. The company opened an internal report and requested an analysis of the footage from the gas station where I had stopped, as well as the cameras from the original parking yard. I had to write a detailed description of the route, the exact times of each stop, and the time spent outside the cab. Operationally, I was cleared to continue driving, but with stricter monitoring on subsequent trips. There was no formal accusation against me, but the trust wasn't quite at the same level as before, and that weighs more than any written warning. The loss was absorbed as a partial cargo loss without external fanfare, but internally, it became a recurring topic of conversation in logistics meetings. Whenever a discrepancy arose in another shipment, my name was mentioned in connection with the previous case, even without concrete proof of my fault. I continued working normally, meeting deadlines and routes, but now each shipment and each inspection had to be done with extra care. The seal may remain intact, but the peace of mind is no longer the same. I still drive through Kentucky frequently, passing by that same illuminated checkpoint and the industrial access road where I made the delivery. From the outside, nothing has changed. The yard is still operating, the shifts are still rotating, the seals are still being placed in front of me as always. But now I observe my surroundings more closely, before getting out of the cab and take a few extra seconds checking details that I previously accepted as automatic routine. It's not overt paranoia. It's a kind of quiet attention that remained after that day. To this day, no one has told me exactly how the cargo was accessed with the seal intact. The company treated it as an isolated incident and moved on, but I never received a definitive technical explanation. What remained was the feeling that something entered and exited my trailer without leaving an external mark, and that's hard to accept when you live with the responsibility for what you transport. Since then, when I see a perfectly gleaming seal on the door, I no longer feel immediate relief. I was stopped waiting for a spot at an urban loading dock in Michigan when I heard the first metallic clunk behind me. It wasn't the sound of cargo shifting. It was that short, metallic on metal sound, like when someone tests a hitch before pulling. I know the sound of my own fifth wheel well, and it didn't sound like a normal adjustment. I looked in the side mirror expecting to see some yard worker maneuvering too close, but there was no one wearing a reflective vest there. The truck hadn't swayed like it does when someone actually couples another tractor unit, but the sound repeated itself a second time. That's when I felt that uneasy feeling rise up before I even understood what was happening. I had arrived too early for the unloading time, and was instructed to wait in a side area of the industrial complex. It was an urban area of Michigan, large warehouses, trucks constantly coming and going. But at that specific point, I was somewhat isolated from the main activity. The cargo was light electronics, palletized, nothing flashy on the outside, but with enough added value to attract the wrong kind of attention. The seal was intact, the documentation checked at the gate, everything within normal protocol. It was supposed to be just another ordinary wait before lining up at the dock. The parking lot wasn't empty, but it wasn't crowded either. There were a few trucks parked further ahead, engines off, drivers probably resting inside the cab. I kept my engine running because the space could become available at any moment. The side street behind me had occasional traffic of small vehicles, employees coming and going. Nothing that seemed out of the ordinary at first glance, except that this area didn't have as many visible cameras as the main entrance. I usually pay attention to my surroundings even when I'm stopped, especially in urban areas. I've seen colleagues lose cargo while distracted by paperwork, but I hadn't gotten off there yet. I was just waiting for instructions over the radio from the yard. When I heard that metallic click for the second time, I didn't feel the full coupling jolt, but I felt a slight different pressure in the assembly. Too small to be an official maneuver, but noticeable to someone who's been sitting there for years. I quickly checked the dashboard to make sure the trailer brake was actually engaged. It was. The parking brake pin also remained pulled, as I had left it when I stopped. This meant that no one should have been trying to tamper with the hitch at that moment. Even so, the sound had been clear, and it wasn't coming from inside the cargo area. I stood motionless for a few seconds, trying to decide if I was overreacting or if I needed to get out of the cab immediately. What really bothered me was realizing I hadn't seen any new horse approaching in the rearview mirror. If someone had been trying to attach another trailer to my horse, I would have noticed more movement. But if it were the other way around, someone trying to pull my trailer with another horse, the blind spot could obscure part of the maneuver for a few seconds. And it was this possibility that made me reach for the door handle before I could even think properly. I carefully opened the door and got out of the cab, trying to act as if I were just doing a normal routine check. I didn't want to show that I had noticed anything specific, because sometimes simply showing attention changes the behavior of someone trying to do something wrong. I walked around the left side of the truck first, keeping enough distance to observe the fifth wheel without exposing myself too much. The asphalt was clean, no tools were scattered on the ground, no obvious sign of tampering. Even so, I felt that the position of the assembly wasn't exactly as I had left it. When I stopped next to the tow hitch, I noticed that the locking lever had been partially moved. It wasn't completely loose, but it also wasn't as firm as before. This kind of detail doesn't stand out to someone who doesn't work with this every day. But to me it was clear that someone had tested the mechanism. I myself had pulled that lock forcefully when parking. That slight difference in position doesn't happen on its own. I then looked further ahead and saw a white horse standing a few meters ahead, lined up at an odd angle for someone just waiting for a parking space. The engine was running, the exhaust releasing light vapor into the cool morning air. The driver didn't get out, didn't signal, didn't seem interested in talking. He just stood there for a few seconds that seemed too long to be a coincidence. It didn't look like a maneuvering error. I could have gone up to him immediately and confronted him directly, but I decided to do things differently. I went back to the cab and honked twice, loud enough to attract the attention of the entire yard. The white horse started moving almost instantly, slowly advancing until it turned the corner of the shed. There was no argument, no explanation, just a clean exit for someone who supposedly wasn't doing anything wrong. When I got out again to inspect it more closely, I realized that the fifth wheel lock had been pulled just enough to allow for quick uncoupling. If I had stayed inside the cab dealing with paperwork or distracted on the phone, a simple correct coupling of another horse would have been enough to get the trailer off the road. That's when I understood it wasn't an improvised attempt, it was a test of time and reaction. And I had only interrupted for a few minutes. I stood there for a few seconds looking at the fifth wheel, trying to figure out how long someone would have needed to work on it without me noticing. It wasn't the use of heavy tools or brute force. It was a quick, precise movement from someone who already knew exactly where to place their hand. While I was analyzing the position of the lock, I noticed a recent mark of displaced grease on the side of the hitch. It was a small detail, but enough to show that it had been manipulated seconds before. I looked around for a visible camera in that side area of the yard and didn't find any pointed directly at where I was. The main entrance was monitored, but the coverage back there seemed too partial. 2 trucks further ahead had their curtains closed, the drivers probably resting, and nobody seemed to have noticed anything. The surrounding urban traffic continued as normal, small cars passing on the outside street as if nothing was happening. This made everything more unsettling. I decided to notify the yard management even before confirming any major damage. I went into the cabin, picked up the internal radio, and reported an attempted tampering with the hitch. On the other end, the response was too calm, asking me to wait for a supervisor to come to the location. While I waited, I looked at the side of the trailer more closely and noticed something I hadn't seen before. The side identification sticker was slightly scratched, as if someone had touched it with metal equipment. When the supervisor arrived, he quickly examined the fifth wheel and agreed that someone had tested the lock. He said he would check the cameras, but made it clear that that area had a limited recording angle. It was at that moment that I noticed another detail that bothered me even more. The tailgate seal was still intact, but the carrier's identification sticker was slightly peeling off at one end. A small thing, but enough to indicate recent contact. I still didn't know if the goal was to take the entire trailer or just test the ease of future swapping. But while I waited for confirmation of the images, I realized that the damage had already occurred on another level. Even if the trailer hadn't been taken that morning, someone had chosen my set to try, and that meant it wasn't by chance. Confirmation that something bigger was at stake came a few minutes later, when the supervisor returned with partial information from the cameras. The white truck had entered the yard a few minutes before I arrived at the side area and was not on the scheduled unloading list for that time. It circled slowly along the side of the warehouse and stopped exactly behind my trailer long enough for a quick attempt. There was no clear record of the license plate because of the camera angle. That made it clear that it wasn't a simple route error. While we were talking there next to the truck, I received a call from the company asking if I had changed positions in the yard without notice. According to the tracking, there was a slight weight fluctuation registered in the system minutes before the noise I heard. This meant that the trailer experienced slight external traction, even without fully uncoupling. The attempt wasn't just a visual test. There was real effort to move the unit, and that already constituted operational damage. I could have left immediately after the scare and waited for instructions at a safer location, but the cargo was already partially compromised simply because they had tampered with the hitch. The risk of structural damage to the locking mechanism required a complete inspection before continuing the journey. While we waited for an in-house mechanic to check the system, it became clear that, even without total loss of the trailer, the scheme had progressed enough to cause damage. The discovery had prevented something worse, but it didn't stop the impact. The inspection confirmed that the fifth wheel lock suffered forced wear on the safety pin, enough to require replacement before any new coupling. This meant temporary immobilization of the truck and an immediate delay in unloading, in addition to the cost of parts and labor. The company treated it as an attempted aggravated theft and filed a formal report. But since the trailer was not taken, the case was classified as damage and a failed attempt. Even so, that day's schedule was lost, and another driver had to take over part of the next route. Financially, it wasn't a total loss of cargo, but there were real costs associated with emergency maintenance and unforeseen downtime. Internally, my name became linked to the incident as the driver of the vehicle at the time of the attempt, which automatically leads to questioning even when the fault doesn't lie with the driver. I continued working normally after that, but each stop at an urban dock was made with extra caution regarding the surroundings. Because once someone tests your trailer, you know it wasn't a random choice. After that day, I started always parking in areas with a visible camera pointed directly at the trailer hitch, even if it meant waiting longer for a parking space. It might seem like a small detail to an outsider, but the fifth wheel became my first point of check whenever I stop at an urban loading dock. It's not exaggerated fear. It's an adjustment after learning that someone tried to steal my trailer while I was just a few meters away. The city continues to function normally, trucks coming and going all the time, but I no longer see that movement in the same way. The trailer wasn't taken, the cargo didn't disappear completely, and officially the case ended as a failed attempt with technical damage. However, the financial loss did occur and was recorded in the report, along with my name in the field for the driver responsible for the vehicle. Since then, every time I hear a metallic clang behind me, I don't wait for the second repetition before getting out of the cab. Thanks for riding along today. If you enjoyed this haul, please leave a like and a comment. Those simple actions tell the YouTube algorithm to deliver our stories to a wider audience, and it truly helps this channel grow. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.